Let's move to this now. As Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza undergoes a raid by Israeli occupation forces, which says its troops have concrete evidence that Hamas is using the facility as a terror HQ, a position some doctors at the hospital have challenged and asked for proof of. The entire strip is going to be plunged into a blackout of communications, raising concerns for the safety of patients, staff and civilians who are sheltering there. More and more voices are calling for a ceasefire, and the South African government is asking the ICC to investigate Israel for war crimes. Andrew Feinstein, the founding director of Shadow World Investigations, an organization that looks into things like grand-scale corruption and corporate bad behavior, among others, joins us tonight. Andrew is an author and the son of a Holocaust survivor and the first ANC MP to introduce a motion on the Holocaust in Parliament. And he's been speaking quite loudly and passionately about his concerns of the choices the government of Israel is making in this moment. Andrew, good evening to you and welcome. You warn that this is the most right-wing Israeli government in history, that Israel is sleepwalking into fascism. It's an ideology that exalts nation and race above all else. Explain that view to our viewers. You're on mute, Andrew.
Hi. Apologies. You'd think after all these years we'd at least be able to unmute ourselves.
It happens every night. You're not alone.
It's very good to be with you. Thanks for having me. The reality is that if you simply look at the politicians who constitute the current Israeli government, they identify themselves as proudly fascist, as proudly homophobic, as proudly racist. This all comes from their own statements. This is not something that we make up in a video I've done with an outlet called Double Down News in the United Kingdom. We actually show these speeches by these senior cabinet members in Prime Minister Netanyahu's sixth cabinet, which is his current cabinet. For instance, Minister Ben-Gvir, who is the Minister of National Security. So this is an incredibly important cabinet post in the Israeli context, is someone who just days before the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated for entering into a peace process with the Palestinians, Ben-Gvir appeared on television with a religious ornament that was stolen from the car of Prime Minister Rabin. And he said on television, he said, "Today we have got to Rabin's car. Tomorrow we get to Rabin." Netanyahu himself marched in front of a coffin with Rabin's name on it. Again, just a few days before the Prime Minister was assassinated. These are people who, in any normal functioning democracy where the rule of law operated, would be in jail, not in high political office.
Well, as you describe, Andrew, this goes back many years when the first seeds were sown to fruit this outcome of the pursuit of a greater Israel. How did some of these individuals who at one time parochial in Israeli politics become so influential?
Out of desperation on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu to stay in power. And Netanyahu, who, as I mentioned, has formed 6 governments in Israel now, is not a particularly popular politician in Israel itself anymore. He has been involved in corruption scandal after corruption scandal. He's a big talker, but he very seldom walks the talk on whatever topic we're talking about, including national security and defense. He has brought about judicial overhauls in Israel, where he's basically trying to subordinate the judiciary to parliament. And the main reason he's doing that is twofold. One, so that the Israeli Defense Force can do whatever they want in the occupied territories with no accountability. And two, so he can avoid prosecution for his various corrupt deals, some of which he's even been charged for. So he brought in the extreme right wing because they were the only people he could form a government with. And this is why these thugs, these fascist criminals, now occupy the key positions in the Israeli government. And they all have, as you've mentioned, this ideology of a greater Israel, where they don't believe the occupied Palestinian territories should exist. They believe that that is Israeli territory. And now they're able to play out that fantasy of theirs about a greater Israel in the most gruesome and brutal way.
Andrew, one of the things you have said is that you're driven by your Judaism, of which you are proud. We see a number of protests where there are Jews who participate in pro-Palestinian protests, but we also see pro-Israeli protests. If it is so clear, as you say, that there is this descent into fascism of the kind that seeks to obliterate, ethnically cleanse, is genocidal, as are some of the terms that have been used in international bodies, many of them. Why is it that there isn't more of an uprising against the government of Benjamin Netanyahu? He didn't vote himself into power.
The way in which Israeli politics operate is you always have to form coalitions. It's a primarily PR system. And so these coalitions of minority parties are cobbled together. The reality is that Israel has been moving more and more right-wing, more and more racist, more and more fascist, if you will, over the last 15, 18 years, since Netanyahu's real rise to power. It's a combination of factors. It's to do with the immigration into Israel of Jews from certain parts of the world who hold fairly reactionary views. They've often been housed on illegal settlements in occupied Palestinian territories, where their security and their subsidies from the Israeli state are primary to them, and unsurprisingly, I suppose. They have also on occasion brought with them quite racist views, to be frank about it. And those have taken hold in Israeli society. We shouldn't forget that before the attacks of 7th of October, when Hamas brutally attacked Israeli civilians, which of course created a whole very defensive and national security reaction from Israelis, as you can well understand and imagine. It was one of the worst attacks on Israeli civilians in many years, but is unfortunately not surprising, given that the occupied Palestinian territories have been under occupation, and a brutal and illegal occupation, for 70 years now. But internationally, there's a very interesting thing happening. So let me take the United Kingdom, where I live. We have had demonstrations over the last few weekends, growing and growing in size. So this past weekend's demonstration was anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million people coming out in support of Palestine and demanding an immediate ceasefire now. There have been very, very small pro-Israel demonstrations. There was one far right-wing fascist demonstration, very small, that tried to take control of the cenotaph, where Armistice Day celebrations were due to take place over the weekend. But our politicians, all of our mainstream politicians in this country and all of the mainstream media are very supportive of Israel. So we have a situation where the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has basically condemned these pro-Palestinian marches and tried to get the police to ban them. We have a situation where even the centre-left newspaper, The Guardian, will print sort of 3 articles that are effectively pro-Israel before it will present any other side of the story. The leader of the opposition, my own constituency MP, Keir Starmer, won't allow his MPs to vote for a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire, which is the most extraordinary situation. So I think that whole environment has been created in which this is happening, and is making it very difficult for people to actually see that war crimes are being committed, that the international rule of law is being undermined. And this has huge consequences, not just for Israel and the Palestinian territories, but for the whole world. And
on that note, we have to leave it there. But thank you again for sharing your perspective with us. We appreciate it. Andrew Feinstein, Shadow World Investigations founding director, sharing his views on what's unfolding in the Middle East. We'll be back after this break.